the Zorros that we're going to be speaking about with the night flying, they were, what was their call sign? What was their number? Weren't they the 22nd?
They were the 22nd. When prior to October of 69 and mid 69 or so, the three squadrons, the 1st, the 22nd, and the 602nd. The 1st was primarily dedicated at that time to covering ground troops in insertion and day strike in the Laotian Panhandle, which went by the call sign of Steel Tiger. Laos had a northern portion that we call barrel roll missions. It had a panhandle which encompassed the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was known as Steel Tiger. And so the 1st worked on day strikes on the edge of Steel Tiger, not right into the Ho Chi Minh Trail because at daytime it was very dangerous. And then they would work prairie fire missions, which was the covering of the special operations groups that we would put on the ground.
If something went wrong, they would call prairie fire.
Prairie fire was, you got to get me out,
yeah.
Bring it. The 602nd that I was in did day strike in the barrel roll and did all the search and rescue. Okay, and so that was the two missions there. The 22nd, as they got into it, they recognized that they needed a lot of night flying, and they stood up the 22nd Squadron, Special Operations Squadron. They brought in a lot of Air Defense Command people because they were very good instrument pilots, and they would do primarily night work. Okay, they call sign Zorro, if you remember, Zorro worked at night, So the 22nd flew nights. Now, by the time I got there, after mid-1969, the wing that we were in said, wait a second, this isn't working out. The division of labor, as it were, is not working out. So all the squadrons did all the missions. Okay, so what I just described was not in place in October of 69. Everybody shared the SAR missions. Everybody shared the prairie fire missions. Everybody shared strikes daytime and nighttime in Steel Tiger and barrel roll, and everybody flew nights.
So I think one person I interviewed a couple years ago said when you hadn't flown night missions in a while, he said, your first night mission was nothing short of terrifying. He said, by the 3rd, you were okay doing that. Can you walk me through a night mission and what did you have to do to get prepared? And let's talk about, it would probably be interdiction, wouldn't it be?
Well, there was two, depending on where you went, okay? The barrel roll missions were more close air support missions because we were supporting the Laotian, friendly Laotian troops, generally in the Plain de Jars region of northern Laos and stretched out there.
That was General Vang Pao's.
Vang Pao was the commander at that point, and primarily Hmong tribesmen under his command. So it was support of them in northern Laos. In the Steel Tiger, it was mostly interdiction on the trail.
Okay.
The trail, the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Now, you would get briefed by a FAC. Were the FACs out there in the evening as well, or would that be coming in?
It depended, So maybe I just talk about night flying and the terrors of night flying. So, you can't see at night. It's dark, and...
If you could tell about the instruments, again, this is a World War II aircraft. It didn't have all the modern equipment that, say, a jet would have. So night flying you had to have your skill set.
It was demanding. It certainly was. You relied on what you could see out the front of the airplane and your instruments. You had an attitude indicator. It's the same sort of thing that you'd use flying in clouds. Okay, you could certainly depending on what the lighting conditions were, whether there was a moon out, or you could see some things, but generally you were relying a lot on instruments. Your night vision was very important, so you would try not to be exposed to bright lights as you went on into it. We would keep everything very, you wanted to get the cockpit lighting, which you could adjust up or down. By cockpit lighting, I mean the lighting on the instruments, not the light like you would have over in a room. You'd start off with them a little brighter and then keep turning them down as you could and still see them, but be able to look outside and see what little things you could see outside. We would carry the early rechargeable flashlights made by, I want to say, Sanyo, okay, which was a little flashlight about twice as big as or half again as big as a pack of cigarettes, perhaps. We would put those on a loop, tie them around or hang them over your neck so you could take the flashlight and point at different things. It had two lenses. One was bright, white, and one we would put the cap of a red plastic cap over front of it, so you were showing red light, which is better for your night vision. And we would use that to look at different things where you wouldn't have to turn the light up within the cockpit.
So you actually used a flashlight with a homemade lens cover.
Yeah.
And that just speaks to the ingenuity of everything that I've heard.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the worst thing that could happen to you at night was you lost your electrical failure, because then your instruments wouldn't work, and you had to have a flashlight to look at your needle and ball and that sort of stuff. So I would carry 3 flashlights with me. I had that Sanyo mostly. I had a regular GI gooseneck flashlight with a red lens on it that I would use primarily for pre-flighting the aircraft before I went up, and then I had a small flashlight that I would pen light, kind of, they called it, that I would keep in the side pocket of my flight suit.
How long would your missions last from takeoff to landing, where you would go out and fly at night? Are we talking an hour, 2 hours?
Oh, again, it would vary to where you're going. So going up to the barrel roll, they could be 3-hour missions or so. Going to Steel Tiger, which was really very close to Nakhon Phanom, they could be an hour and a half, 2 hours.
So the terrain, if you went up into the barrel roll, I mean, that is incredibly mountainous terrain up there, correct? Is that
absolutely
towards Magia Pass? And
yeah. Well, Magia Pass is in Steel Tiger.
Is it?
Yeah. The barrel roll was, like I say, plain to Jars, and then there was the Ban Dan Valley, and then
That's
out into North Vietnam itself, bordered on North Vietnam. And so, yeah, very mountainous terrain. Up in the barrel roll, you had limited navigational aids, electronic navigational aids, and you would essentially you'd lose them before you got to where you really wanted to go. So you were navigating by dead reckoning. Here's where I know I am, here's where I want to go, a time and a distance and the speed you were going and the heading, and throw in an approximation for what the wind is, and that's how you would get to something. And you can't see the ground, while you're doing it.
Oh my gosh. Holy cow. That would be absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, very different than these days with satellite navigation and that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, it could last a number of hours. Interestingly, I thought, and you talked about somebody just starting to night fly again, not the hardest, but one of the more challenging things was the actual takeoff. Now you think of that as pretty mundane, but we would taxi the aircraft out with full fuel and a massive load of ordnance, and you would actually be over the gross weight of the allowable for takeoff when you left the chocks. And you would burn down enough gas, taxiing out and going through the arming and everything, that theoretically you were down to the maximum gross weight when you were taking off. So here we are taking off at max gross weight out of Nakhon Phanom at dark. You've got runway lighting and stuff, but outside the base perimeter, there's nothing. There's no cities nearby, very little light, and so you're taking off. You're not climbing. A-1 didn't climb very fast, and so you would take off with takeoff flaps, and then when you lift your flaps up, the aircraft would kind of sink a little bit because until it got going. So you didn't want to be doing that when you're going over the edge of the runway, and there's nothing to be seen out there. So it was a tricky deal to take off, get off your flaps. You would be very low by the time you get off the end of the runway, and climb up gradually and get up to where you felt comfortable reasonably by 1,000 feet above the ground or so. So amazingly, the heart throb beats went on the takeoff. You know, I'd always pull on the runway and I'd check everything real hard and make sure everything was working. I'd reach down and touch the extraction handle that we had. It was a Navy style seat where you'd pull up some handle underneath between your legs. I reached down to make sure I knew where that was before I take off, and run everything up and make sure everything was working exactly right, because if that engine burped, you were in trouble.
Did you ever have any trouble like that when you took off? Anything that was...
I had one mission where, so we had, it was a reciprocating engine. If the engine was starting to come apart, it would throw off metal into the oil pan, and they had something called a sump light. It was a magnetic detector that would detect metal chips in the oil, and which was a precursor to the engine failing. And so there was a light that was kind of right there under the windscreen that would turn red if you had a sump light on, and that could be a false indication. You could be okay. It could be your engine was getting ready to quit. And so I had a sump light come on at the worst time, right over the end of the runway at night, heavy. And I said, oh my gosh, Now we had lost an airplane not too long before, where exactly the same thing happened, and the guy went in off the end of the runway. We lost him. So I was worried, So I pulled the airplane, or I say pulled, I turned it up, got onto a downwind, dropped all my ordnance out there safe, jettisoned the ordnance so that I could land, and came back in and landed. Unfortunately, the engine did not stop,
But that must be the biggest red light you've ever seen in your life.
Gosh, yeah, and like I say, it was right there where you could not avoid it. It was right there in front of everything.
I believe it was Rich Hall when he was interviewing with me. He was on a night mission, and he was somewhere up north. He said, I'm 100 miles from anywhere. And he said, let me tell you what, he said, when that chip light came on, he said, only dogs could have heard me, because I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. No, it gets your attention. The other interesting thing, dark humor, if you will. So we had an external fuel tank, a main fuel tank that we'd always fly with. And you would try to burn up that fuel first in case you had to jettison it. You'd have a full internal fuel if you had to go anywhere. So you would run that tank on the ground, and then when you got ready to take off, you would go into your main tanks in the fuselage, and then you take off. And one of the early things that you would do would go back onto your jettison tank, your drop tank, and you knew that the way it would work is you would run the gas out of that drop tank and your engine would stop. And then quickly, if you turn over to the main tank, it would start up again. Okay, so you knew, within a couple of minutes when that was going to happen, and you would talk over in the briefing, okay, we're going to be at this stage of the mission when our tanks will run dry, and, you tell your wingman that you ran your tank dry so you would have an idea how much fuel you'd have. But it was always a heart palpitation when you're out over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and your tank runs dry, even though you're expecting it, because my engine stopped, oh my God, but millisecond later, you said, oh, it's just a tank, and you turn it back on,
Holy cow, that had to just about tear it. I mean, it must have stopped you in your tracks for a second.
Yeah,
So how many different, you had 3 tank stations, one on each, you had the center and...
one on each stub, but typically we would just use the centerline tank.
Okay.
Different missions configurations, you would use one on the stub as well.
And as soon as you switched it over, the engine would catch.
It would catch back up, just a brief time, but enough to have your heart miss a beat or two.
Now, were you ever in combat, in strafing or interdiction, taking fire when that would happen?
No, you would not attack with your drop tank on in normal conditions. You would go into internal as one of the things that you would do prior to striking.
That's very interesting. You know, I've heard many. There's those songs, the songs, the SPAD songs, and when they're talking, they said go internal. I always wondered what they meant by going internal. Was drop the tank and go internal and go into action.
Yeah. Switch over to your main fuel tank.
Oh wow! And so you jettison at that point, do what you had to do.
Yeah.
Can you talk me through a night mission where you would take fire, or what it was like? What did you see?
Okay, well, again, it varied between the barrel roll typical mission and the Steel Tiger typical mission. Barrel roll, again, there was less ground fire, not no ground fire, but less ground fire, and you were more often either working with a ground fac, a Laotian troop on the ground, or you were just on your own DRing and armed reconnaissance looking for something. So the difference in the ordnance loads reflected that. So when we were flying up to the barrel roll, we would carry 2 flare canisters, and by the flare canister had 4 tubes in each one and had 2 flares in each canister. So you could eject flares out of the back, parachute flares. They would ignite, float down. You could see stuff on the ground, theoretically. And you had 2 of those. And they were massive, and the drag on them was phenomenal. And so you didn't like to carry those, but you had to because you didn't have any means to look at the ground without igniting that. Mm-hmm. Now, because it was relatively permissive, you could drop those flares up there and not necessarily get your tail shot off.
Wow.
We would also carry the standard load of hard bombs, 500-pound general purpose bombs. We would carry CBU, rear ejection, CBU 14 typically, or 25, and then napalm.
Now, the CBU was used as an anti-personnel weapon, correct? If you were trying to drop that on enemy positions?
Yes.
And it would spread out versus being one.
That's correct. Yeah, it was 7 tubes that would eject out the rear with compressed gas. Would eject out the rear, and there was bomblets, numerous bomblets in each tube, and you could punch them off in a string, and it would give a linear pattern on the ground.
Oh wow. Oh, wow.
And then napalm was beneficial at night because it burned on the ground. And now you had something on the ground burning that you could use as a reference with you and your wingman, or if there was a FAC or a ground FAC could sit there.
And they could tell you where you needed to adjust fire or adjust your ordnance.
Exactly. Yeah.
So can you talk me through any mission that you remember and conversations that may have happened between you and the ground FAC or air FAC?
Yeah. I'm looking here.
Tom is so good. He brought notes.
Well,
I brought notes. I'm so proud of you.
Well, I got a good memory. It's just short. And the other thing that we carried at night, ordnance-wise, that was unusual. We didn't use it at daytime. Was something that we called logs. And this was a device that looked like a log that you would drop off the aircraft, and it would ignite and burn very slowly on the ground and last for a long time. And so you had a fire source or a light source on the ground that would just burn for a long time, so you could drop that down and use it as a reference point to where it was. And it wasn't meant to harm anybody necessarily. It was just
a marker.
Just a marker, yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.